Hey guys, John Paulamy here, Actionable Intelligence. Today is Sunday, June 7th, 2020. This is the weekly market update. So, I've been observing and watching and thinking about the last couple weeks' events, the last several months' events. What am I talking about? COVID-19 virus scare, the recent events in Minneapolis, a city I'm familiar with. I'm from that area. The apparent killing of a person in police custody by use of excessive force, which resulted in for what lack of a better term can be called protests or riots, depending on how you look at it, depending on what city, breaking out all over the United States. And I think what we're seeing here, to my mind, and I have to be careful when I'm talking about this because I want to make sure that my words are understood correctly. The opinions and observations I'm making are not what I hope happens. I'm not rubbing my hands together, oh, death porn, revolution porn, Mad Max society. What I'm saying is what I think is going to happen. Because as this is a speculative / investment channel, we are forced to try to make odds on what we think might happen in the future in order to properly position our portfolios. And so what I think we've seen here is what we get into, what Neil Howe talked about in his book, The Fourth Turning. It's an indication of a fourth turning that's in progress. And I don't have time in the confines of this video to go into what a fourth turning is, but I'll just summarize from the Wikipedia page, and you can look Neil up and listen to interviews where he discusses this if you don't want to read the whole book. But basically, the fourth turning is a crisis in society. This is an era of destruction, often involving war or revolution, in which institutional life is destroyed and rebuilt in response to a perceived threat to the nation's survival. After the crisis, civic authority revives, cultural expression redirects towards community purpose, and people begin to locate themselves as members of a larger group. Well, we've had probably in these turnings that they talk about, there's 4 of them within a span of 80 to 100 years. And you go from an awakening to crisis to, you have to kind of take a look at it. I'll put a link to the Wikipedia page if you're not familiar. And like I said, you can listen to some of their interviews that they've done to discuss this. And basically, what we have entered to in the United States is this crisis environment, not precipitated by the COVID, not precipitated by, or not solely the reason being the death of this particular one individual. It's basically a response to what we see as crumbling institutions, ineffective institutions, whether they're educational, whether they're political, social. The needs of people are not being met. People do not feel like they're participating in this society. People feel that they're marginalized, and not just blacks. That was the manifestation of the whole Trump phenomena. People have this thing that, Trump is just nothing but a manifestation of about 65 million people's lack of feeling of participation in the economy for the last 30 years, as the elites of this country have sold out the majority. And you can see it right now. You've got all this stuff going on. You have these insurrections, these looting going on. Police, government is ineffective to control it. No one can stop it. It kind of burns itself out, kind of like the virus does, right? But look at the destruction. And then we look at the feckless leaders. A perfect example was this ridiculous mayor that they have in Minnesota. I can't get into the heads of people of how they feel or why they feel the way they do. I don't try not to think irrationally. But, you have what exactly is being protested here? That a guy was killed by the police. The police are now under indictment. You have a city that has basically been run by the Democratic Farmer Labor Party, which is basically now at this point in time, a far left-wing party. If the mayor of the city's a Democrat, feckless, weak, soft, transplant. He's not even from Minnesota. You have a city council that has, I think, 13 members. I think 12 of them I know for a fact are DFLers, and the other one's a Green Party member. The police chief of Minneapolis is an African American. If they're not going to make changes, who is going to make changes? If all the policies that are being espoused for years, this isn't just like a recent phenomenon in the city of Minneapolis. This has been going on. It's been a leader in progressive thought for decades. And yet you have a police force that has people on it that are using excessive force. How is that possible? What are people protesting? Against themselves? They voted these people in. They're not making the requisite changes that they want. The mayor, there's a video of the mayor, this little, 30-year-old, his jeans and T-shirt, walks up to, there's a group of Black Lives Matter folks protesting, and he comes up there with his COVID-19 mask on, and they ask him, hey, are we going to defund the police and, use the money for, community uplift or whatever these people think that we should use the money for. And he said, no, we're not going to defund the police. And he's just unilaterally booed out of there. It looked like he was walking away with his hands in his pocket with his head down. This is America. This is the fecklessness of government. This is the inability. This is what people see. This is the crisis that is in this country. There was another video, I can't find it, I wish I could, and it showed, I don't even know where it was, it showed some BLM protesters walking through presumably a suburb or suburban area or a non-urban area where majority of people seem to be white. And they were walking down the street peacefully with signs about Black Lives Matter, which is their right. And all the white suburban people were standing on the grass next to the street with their AR-15s and shotguns, and as is their right. Is that kind of sums up the divide? Are those people they have views of each other which may or may not be correct, but they do exist. So what are we going to do? Sit down over a box of Entenmann's and coffee and just figure this out? I don't see it. The divides in this country have been put in place because of economic and social turmoil that has been neglected for decades. It is exacerbated by a media and political elite which uses these divides to maintain deep state power for their own benefit. Do you notice that during this whole COVID thing and all, we're over $7 trillion on the Fed's balance sheet, and we're having supposedly a pandemic that if we don't keep the economy locked down is going to kill everybody. We have insurrections going on in major cities around the United States where looting and burning and violence is taking place, like it's a Hollywood movie, The Purge, and yet the stock market's making near all-time highs? Really? That's your Project Zimbabwe. The printed money, the created money, as many Austrian economists have said, always benefits the people that get it first, which are the banking class, the investment class. They're putting it to work in the markets, and the markets are making all-time highs. So you're telling me that people should have investment and care about this particular system? They don't. What are the shared values of this country between these inner cities and these rural and suburban people? The flag? No, we don't. We're gonna burn flags. We're gonna take the flag down. Drew Brees was driven, to making apologies because he said something that the zeitgeist didn't approve of as respect to the American flag. An old guy, veteran, was beaten on the street because he had a flag and he was, out there. Now, I wouldn't do these things. I wouldn't go to anywhere near any of these protests or these riots. You're just asking for trouble. But don't people have a First Amendment right to do that? How are you going to reconcile this? And I guess people would say, well, what are you getting at? Well, I don't see how the political and social divides that are increasing in the United States, how does the United States go forward with all of the problems that it has, which is not just this particular set of circumstances, but a whole bunch of other social and economic issues which are not solved and will not be solved by the current political class. And how does it go forward as a political entity 10, 20, 30 years from now? What actually binds us as a nation, as a people? The things that I was taught, language, history, values, what are they? I was told that if you work hard, you put your nose to the grindstone, that regardless of your beginning station in life, you can go as far as your talents and abilities take you. And now we're told that's not the case, that this is the worst country on earth, systemic racism. Yet I'm on LinkedIn and I'm seeing all kinds of African American PhDs and MBAs and college graduates celebrating with huge smiles on their face their graduations. I've worked in Central America. I've worked in foreign third world countries. They're very stratified societies. They're very racially conscious society, not racially conscious, racially segregated. If you go to a place like Central America, you will see the conquistador class, the European class that came there hundreds of years ago that still controls the majority of the wealth in these places and the political environment in these places. You see a mestizo class that's kind of your technocrats, engineers. Then you still have, racially pure Indian class of Indians. And you could have 150 IQ and be an Indian in a village, and you're not very difficult to get out of your stratification, where you're segregated to in society. But that's not the case here in the U.S. We're told that this is the worst country on earth. It certainly has had problems, but I would say it's been the most progressive in fixing its problems. We have more and more people trying to come here for a reason, because it is that beacon of hope, or was, but the light's beginning to flicker. So I reject when people say that we have these huge problems. What we have is a lot of times is an accountability and responsibility problem, but that's beyond the pale of this. We have a class of people now that have been told and steeped in leftist, Marxist ideology since they were in kindergarten. The media, Hollywood, the elite class has told people that you can't bootstrap your way up, yet people do it all the time. We're told by the previous administration, you didn't build that. They tell people that, the poor guy that I was talked about last week that was standing on the street had his business destroyed arbitrarily by closures of businesses, arbitrarily by some governor. He said he would rather risk getting COVID than have the business that he worked for 30 years destroyed, his life's work. I saw it in the former Soviet Union. Go there and you see people that are 70, late 60s, 70 years old, 80 years old. Their whole life that they knew was the Soviet Union, and they pined for it. And you say to yourself, don't you see the contradictions or the fact that it couldn't work? But it's hard to tell somebody that worked their whole life in some particular business or some type of environment that their life was basically thrown away for nothing. And that's what you're telling a lot of these business people. And now we find out, as we have more information, that this virus isn't really that big of a deal. Yes, 100,000 people have died, but we're not sure if the count is really correct, are we? Because we don't have trust in our institutions. We're told to wear a mask, then we're told not to wear a mask. We're told if you wear a mask, you could have hypoxia, that you could increase the viral load in the mask. We're told if you don't wear the mask, you can't come into a store. People are screamed at in certain places because they didn't have a mask on and berated. And yet we still have tens of millions of people unemployed, businesses shuttered and destroyed permanently, and then people thinking that this is just going to get turned back on. So what I'm getting at is, whatever your belief system is, I think the shared thing that we can probably all agree with is our lack of trust in our institutions. They've let us down. And who really has the answers? And in this type of environment, how does the United States, with so many different divisions and so many, and just to say, well, we need a leader that can bring us together, that's total bullshit. The values are not the same with all of the people in the United States. That's the main problem. I don't share the values with these people that are protesting. I don't agree with them. I'm not going to bend a knee. And I'm going to maintain that. Am I empathetic? Yes, but I have seen plenty of people that have come here. I'm in business with people that have come here from other countries that were way worse than the United States ever was, that have been extremely successful. And they've had to overcome language barriers. They've had to come over with no resources at all, no advantages, nothing, and have come here and are glad to be here. So what I will say, just to close this section out of this editorial, and I expect to get a lot of feedback, both positive and negative, but I will tell you one thing that is a fact. Federal background checks increased 75% in May compared with 2019, a further acceleration from April's 69% gain over the previous year. Handguns in particular were up 94%. Background checks are largely considered a proxy for gun purchases in the absence of more granular sales data. I've seen anecdotal evidence where people that have a lot of liberal friends in liberal states are asking how to buy a gun for the first time. I think that's interesting. I think that is an interesting question to ask. So let's move on. Talking about Mr. Powell and his money-making machine. I thought this was an interesting comment I saw on Twitter. This particular individual, which shows you the schizophrenia that we're really dealing with and the volatility. We've gone from recession to depression to recovery to euphoria in less than 100 days. And I would say that that's accurate. And you throw all the stuff that's going on in the background and you wonder, how did we get to a euphoria? Well, it's the Powell bubble. One thing I wanted to point out, took this off Zero Hedge. This is a chart that shows the NASDAQ versus the Bloomberg Commodity Index. As you can see, it's way out of whack from normal. This is 2008, I believe. Or no, this isn't 2008. This is, I'm not sure. But anyways, I can't read the charts, too blurry. Suffice to say, the NASDAQ is trading at 152 times multiple of the Bloomberg Commodity Index. So what I'm trying to tell you is that money creation is not going into commodities. It's not manifesting itself particularly in the rise in commodities. I'm suggesting it will eventually. What it's doing is going into the stock market. And that's what this article says. The bulk of the newly created liquidity has flooded into stocks, even as commodities, which tend to be far better representation of overall economic state, languish. The average ratio since the end of 2001 has been nearer to 37. So typically the NASDAQ since 2001 at least has seen the ratio being at 37 times, the NASDAQ being 37 times the Bloomberg Commodity Index. We're at 152. Now, there's not enough data here to say what it should be and what's the historical narrative and whether we're going to see a mean reversion. What I'm saying to you is that this looks really out of whack. This looks like parabolic, unsustainable, and ripe for a turn. That's all I'm suggesting when I show you this. So, wanted to give you some tanker porn. This is a chart, and I've also highlighted an article from a website that did a pretty good, extensive breakdown of all the the order book for all levels of tankers, whether they're VLCCs, which are the largest, very large crude carriers, next in line Suezmax down to Aframax, and I think Handysize Max, but I don't know. I think it goes all the way down to Aframax. Basically what we see the same thing. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at the last basically 15 years, and on the right we have the order book as a percent of the fleet. So we're saying that the order book for new very large crude carriers is less than 10% of the overall fleet, which, as you can see, is a recent historical low. So what we're saying is we're not looking forward to seeing a bunch of brand new tankers coming online. Conversely, the red line is the average age of the VLCC fleet. It's now at a recent all-time high, which is pushing up around 10 years, which is instructive because these tankers, 15 to 20 years is the life. A lot of them are being used right now for crude storage, and when they come off, when you start getting into the higher age brackets of these tankers, like you get up 10 or 15 years, the special survey that's required when you have to place the ship into the shipyard, it has to be inspected in order to get a certificate so that it can actually carry crude, gets progressively more expensive. So I guess what I'm suggesting is tankers are like every other commodity. It's a supply-demand driven market. We are seeing lower supply as indicated by the lack of new orders, and yet we're seeing a aging of the fleet, which indicates to me that we should see the supply shrink. Okay, so we're seeing less new builds, the fleet get older, which is going to lead to more scrapping. As I pointed out in a previous video, maybe in the last couple weeks, if you do a cursory listen to most of the tanker managements in their recent first quarter earnings calls, you will note that they are asked just about on every call what they're looking to do with all this cash that they've gotten, and whether or not they were going to be building new ships. And they have all definitively said no, they didn't intend to do that. Why would you? Right now they need to get their balance sheets repaired, which is happening. They're paying out dividends, and many of them are buying back stock. Why? Because the net asset value of the companies is way less than the book value, or you're selling below book value or below net asset value if you liquidated the tankers. So it's cheaper just to buy your own stock than it is to build new ships. And, after you have these brutal bear markets in these industries, that's typically what happens. Now, I think that they eventually will ruin their industry like they always do. Rates will, although be volatile going forward, will be progressively higher as we go through, and they will repair their balance sheets. They will have their stock prices flying. This will be an industry in favor again, and all kinds of excuses about why it's going to go to the moon. And then they will start buying ships, and they will oversupply the market, and then we will have another subsequent crash in rates, and nobody will care about tankers for 10 years. But that is down the line. I will put a link to the article that I was talking about that you'll be able to read. One of the conclusions that the authors came to was, with respect to tankers at least, this is the best supply-demand fundamentals in the last 2 decades across all classes of tankers, not just VLCCs, but Suezmaxes and Aframaxes. So I continue to own a lot of tankers. I continue to expect a lot of volatility in rates. However, I do expect rates overall to be higher year to year, for cash flows to expand, and for this industry to get re-rated. That's my expectation. If you're going to just trade it based on short-term rate announcements, this isn't the right deal for you, more than likely. Let's talk about the rig count. So we got the U.S. rig count has now fallen below 300. This is getting really ugly. Down to 284 for those are all oil and gas rigs. The significant fall in the rig count over the last couple months is also reflected in a steady decline of the EIA's estimate for oil production in the United States, which fell again this week to 11.2 million barrels of oil per day on average, which is 1.9 million barrels per day off the all-time high and 200,000 barrels per day lower than the week prior. So what you're seeing is the Red Queen has flew off the treadmill. She's no longer running faster and why? Because the cash flows don't exist to support progressively more drilling. We've talked about this before. Now, the argument is still being made that, we've seen a really big surge in oil prices. We've seen Brent is over $40 a barrel. West Texas is right up there bumping against it. It's really had a great move, oil has, over the last month. And I'm not saying we're in a new bull market, but we don't know where the price is going to kind of settle at, let's put it that way. I do expect, though, if we continue to see less investment, less rigs turning, less frac crews fracking, U.S. oil production is going to keep going down. And the call on OPEC will eventually have to be made. So they came to some kind of pseudo deal to extend their cuts for another month. We'll see. There's still arguments about how much oil is really in storage. We'll have to watch that. But what is not in doubt is the fact that this capital, with the exception of shale, the rest of the oil industry has been capital starved for many, many years. And if shale doesn't bounce back with higher prices and pick up the slack again, which I'm not sure it's going to be able to do, and I'm going to point out why in subsequent slides, then the call on OPEC and non-OPEC conventional oil production is going to be limited because of the lack of investment that has not happened in those areas for many, many years. So, oil supply set for deficits. This is another article. It's from Rystad Energy. The oil market is set for a deficit from August onwards, even after OPEC Plus eases the current cuts that are up for tentative extension through July. These that will ensure a fundamental support for prices while also spurring a quicker reactivation of curtailed U.S. oil production and eventually frac crews ending their holidays early. Well, that's what we'll see about, won't we? We'll see how much it actually comes back. Now, that's what's happened before. 2 other times that we've had crashes, or the big crash we had back in 2015 when oil prices crashed. We had a lot of turmoil, a lot of layoffs, and then oil prices came back, and all kinds of money came from Wall Street and private equity to give to these people to keep drilling. But I think the mentality has set in now that there's been no really return to shareholders, just drilling for the sake of drilling. So where's the cash flow? Where are the return to cash to shareholders? Where are the dividends? What is the investment thesis of these companies? Just to get as much money as they can and drill, and then tie your stock options to a rising stock price based on drilling more wells? That seemed to be the business model. I'm not sure that works anymore. We saw even before this oil price crash, before this demand crash because of COVID, shale was already starting to go into decline. Why? Because capital was becoming capital starved, and the Red Queen race was not being enabled. You weren't able to keep drilling more and more wells because ding, 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 the light finally went on that this is, for many companies, or most of them, is not a viable business. And this is why I don't think it's going to come back. It will come back to a certain extent. There are operators that can effectively drill, but it's not going to come back to the extent it was before. Why? Because look at this chart. This is the debt and interest that's owed for shale. It's looking at $133 billion of shale debt and interest to be paid between 2020 and 2026. Who's going to give them more money? This has been like a net wealth destruction activity for the most part, if you take it all encompassing. Again, there are select companies, but I don't think you're going to just, ramp everything back up again, because look at this debt. That's why they're turning wells on at $35 a barrel, because they need to get any cash they can just to make these interest payments, just to keep the lights on, or they're going to get foreclosed on. You go bankrupt, the assets don't go away. Somebody just buys them for 10 cents, 20 cents, or whatever the negotiation is on the dollar. The debt goes away to debt heaven, and then new operator comes in with no debt. That changes the whole business dynamic potentially. But that's a process, right? That doesn't take you right back to record oil production. Here's another chart. United States distressed debt ratios. Okay. What is the most impaired industry? Oil and gas. $64.6 billion of the oil and gas debt is in the distressed category. That's going to go to debt heaven, bye-bye land. I mean, you see the spike in speculative grade default rates and what they're anticipating, and you see investment grade. Investment grade debt doesn't really go bankrupt because that's why it's investment grade. And the majority of the debt in this country by these companies is barely hovering above being downgraded to junk or distressed, triple C. What's second? Retail and restaurants. Well, that COVID did that. They're going to put all these companies out of business. No one, if you have to go into a restaurant, it's anecdotal. Somebody told in California they open up a restaurant, you have to wear a mask to the table. Then you take the mask off. You're like 15 feet away from every other table. If you get up and go to the can, you got to put your mask back on. I mean, who the hell's going to go there and spend money at a steakhouse to try to have an experience with somebody? And this is what you're doing, like you're performing an operation, for heaven's sakes. I mean, it's ridiculous. No one's, where I'm at down here in South Texas, I mean, the people are a little bit more, I think, level-headed or have common sense. They get made fun of, because we're down here. It's hot. But, we've lifted a lot of the restrictions. I don't really see, people dying on the street. I've been following our county's health departments. I don't see a spike. But in a lot of places, that's not how it is, right? And the debt is there. Once it's incurred, it has to be paid. So what I'm saying to you is that oil and gas, I think, we're going to have to watch it because the available capital will just not be there to enable the shale miracle. And conversely, the economies are recovering now. If you look at the TSA screening data, the amount of passengers being screened by the TSA is climbing daily. So airlines are turning back on. I think people, just some of the anecdotal things you've seen, like people partying in Missouri at the lakes, people are in close contact. I mean, the whole thing's hypocritical, right? Most of these blue states where this protests / rioting was taking place, most people were running around with no masks on. So if we don't see a big spike in COVID cases, what do we infer from that? So with the amount of damage that's been done, we have expect a lot of volatility, expect a lot of, have to make changes on the fly because we don't know what's going to happen next. That's kind of, I think, what I want to leave you with, that thought. So volatility, a lot of unknowns, and you have to stay flexible on your feet and on your toes because we don't know what's going to happen. And if we're entering the political season, the rhetoric is going to get jacked up like you wouldn't see. It's going to be a long, hot summer. And I suspect that regardless of who wins the election, it's the one half of the country is not going to be happy. So we'll see how that ends up. That kind of ties into my editorial on the front of this particular video. All right, guys, that's it for this week. Appreciate you listening. Appreciate you subscribing. Appreciate you sticking with me. Trying to turn these ideas that we talk about in the video to actionable stock picks. Doing that via the Actionable Intelligence Alert newsletter, which you can subscribe to for $79 per year. I think it's a great value. Subscriptions has really taken off recently, so I hope people are getting value from that. If you want to get a sample of the writings of what we do, I have an offer, which is to become a Patreon member, which helps support my work. And if you become a Patreon member for $5 or more, you will be given one of the most recent stock picks from the newsletter. Now that's it. Let me clarify, that's not a subscription to the newsletter. It's one stock pick that we have recently made in the newsletter, so you can get a sample of the writing that we do. Sometimes that causes confusion when I make this offer, but there's a difference between the newsletter and the one-off for the Patreon support. So hope that you'll support us in our work, and we thank you for listening and supporting, and we look forward to seeing you in the comments. That's it for this week. Take it easy. Goodbye.